Hi, thank you all for coming. As Julia already, I guess I already told you, today I will talk briefly about this very broad topic, that is the essentialist ecofeminist turn in visual arts. I will focus more on the historical material conditions, and less on bringing up examples of these essentialist ecofeminist works that are permeating the cultural and visual sphere. This is a topic that interests me as being very much in connection also with my artistic labor, but also with my political one. So it comes genuinely from an interest in this topic and how it kind of is very present into the cultural medium currently. The PowerPoint, like I'm very bad actually at doing PowerPoints, and it's contra-intuitively for an artist, but I'm not very good. So this PowerPoint is very short, and I focus more on the writing part. So I will start. The essentialist ecofeminist turn in visual arts. It has been several years since ecofeminism resurfaced as one of the most preeminent conceptual frameworks in the visual arts and in the cultural field as such. From the imperial core to its closer and further away semi-peripheries, we witness museums, galleries, art fairs, biennales, books, and conferences becoming abundant with works rejoining the lines of intersection between nature and gender. While largely congruent with an increased interest in the climate change question, the revival of ecofeminism is also the result of gender-related issues permeating the public discourse throughout the last few years. The intersection of these two, ecology and feminism, under the same label, turned ecofeminism into a vast terrain prone to foster a large array of embragements. These embragements, even though coated in a rather seductive but voidant parlance, as it's too often the case in the artistic field, designate ideological directions. Of these, one is distinctively more predominant. This is the direction of essentialist ecofeminism. Currently, this direction is to be found in the language and practice of two seemingly culturally and socially antagonistic categories. That is, the custodians of the traditional conservative values on one hand, and the guardians of the liberal principles on the other. Though their convergence may not be transparent, it is certainly not accidental. This rarely spoken convergence in our art milieu is dictated by their very similar, if not identical, ways of relating to the capital. The ways in which both conservatives and liberals align themselves in ensuring the perpetuation of the same hegemonic ideology of the capitalist system makes them fierce advocates of essentialist ecofeminist ideas, even when their oratorical skills seem to differ. The prevalence of essentialist ecofeminism in our cultural, academic, and even anti-capitalist activist spaces is proof not only of the epistemic crisis we find ourselves in, but also of several other interconnected crises that the ruling class keeps on attributing to a variety of causes and never to the capitalist system of production as such. But before we begin to untangle the capitalist strands that are weaved together in shaping the present essentialist ecofeminist term, I would like to go back to the first time the term ecofeminism was used in the imperial core and to consider the background political, social, and economic conditions that led to its emergence and to its further usage in the cultural sphere. The term ecofeminism was coined by the French activist and author Françoise de Bon in her book titled Le féminisme ou la mort. She uses the term ecofeminism towards the end of her exposé to interrelate women's oppression and nature exploitation as both being products of male dominance with modern societies. Françoise de Bon makes this claim the main argument of her book, which she published in 1974, almost a decade after feminist movements started taking shape all over the Western Bloc, with two different factions aspiring to the forefronts: the Marxist socialist feminist faction on the one hand, and the cultural radical feminist faction on the other. The Marxist socialist faction thought to situate the struggle against male domination within a broader struggle for a socialist transformation of the society as a whole, while the cultural radical feminists regarded the fight against women's oppression as central to their struggle, yet detached from other forms of oppression. On a very simplified level, the Marxist socialist feminist faction was committed to employing a historical materialist approach into their understanding of the women question, while the cultural radical feminist faction was inclined to drawing on a rather idealistic approach, even when frequently trying to address different sides and aspects of gender oppression. Back in the days, both these factions were confronted with challenges to be overcome in order to strengthen and differentiate their approaches. For the Marxist socialist feminists, the biggest challenge was to clarify that the interrelation of gender, class, and race is co-constitutive not only to the women question, as it was previously designated by the Bolshevik feminists, but also to the formulation of a unitary socialist political project. In other words, the challenge was to resist the traditional socialist tendency to treat feminist issues as subsidiary to the process of advancing the socialist struggle. For the cultural radical feminism, the challenge was to overcome the understanding of gender as the main and sole denominator of women's oppression. That is to say, the main challenge for cultural radical feminists was to overcome the prioritization of gender antagonism as autonomous from other multiple antagonism intrinsic to a class-organized society. Only by solving this impasse, they would dissociate themselves from liberal feminists. Lise Vogel has, in this book that is I think essential for understanding the separation between these factions and the history of feminism into the Western imperial core, goes further into discussing this separation, this division between Marxist socialist feminism and cultural feminism, and also in the discussion in how the socialist feminist theory evolved into becoming more and more actually departed from Marxist tradition after the Second International. These challenges that I mentioned for both cultural feminism and Marxist feminism, even though belonging to a certain stage in the historical and intellectual development of the Western feminist movements, are not obsolete, but on the contrary, they still represent relevant obstacles in the configuration of our present feminist movements, should they take root either in the imperial core or on its Eastern European semi-peripheries. In France, le mouvement de libération des femmes, of which François de Beaune was part, was officially founded in 1970, when, as an act of solidarity with the feminist movements in USA, French feminists, including Monique Witting and Christine Delphi, organized a protest of the Monument of the Unknown Soldier in Paris, where they displayed messages such as "Il y a plus inconnu que les soldats, c'est sa femme," or "Un homme sur deux est une femme." These are images from that protest back in 1970. The movement came into being in the context of a broader societal radicalization determined by the general strikes of May '68, which coupled students' revolts with uprising of the working class and the ascension to the public these discursive forefronts of a leftist cultural intelligentsia. Therefore, what started in the mid-60s as a struggle for the right to abortion and contraception, because back in the 60s, in France and in the majority of the Western states, the abortion was forbidden. And this is, I think, a question that is, and an issue that is not very largely discussed, especially in Eastern Europe, where the question of abortion is always used as an anti-communist propaganda. And yeah, this struggle that started as a right to abortion and contraception back in France in the 70s expanded to include demands for gender equality within the household and the workplace, legal actions against sexual assault, and the halting of France's war in Algeria, and of course of the US war in Vietnam. What started then as a struggle for sexual liberation mounted up to be inscribed to the wider material conditions of the present, hence including a growing anti-colonial sentiment shared by many of the women who joined le mouvement de libération des femmes. But as the movement continued to expand and to become more visible in the public sphere, the task of keeping a homogeneous theoretical view and a unitary coordinated action towards emancipation became more and more difficult. The feminists of the movement came to a fragmentation in the mid-70s. Among central figures of le mouvement, around whom new alliances were formed once the movement started to fracture, were Antoinette Fouque, Monique Witting, but also François de Beaune. She left le mouvement with the process of funding the Ecology Feminism Center. The center was a response to the lack of more pronounced interest among feminists with regard to the urgent ecological issues of the day. Founded in 1972, this center aimed at unifying two struggles, the feminist and the ecological one, that seemed to be carried on similar but separate fronts. By bringing together the two, the group centered on building an engaged feminist approach with regard to the environmental global changes that threaten life on Earth and the planet itself. The activist group around de Beaune placed the problem of the death of the planet on the shoulders of the male society and called for a mutation of the world that would allow life to thrive without menace. What this mutation actually meant and how it is supposed to be accomplished need a closer critical examination. But before doing that, I would like to situate this goal to remake the planet around a totally new model within the material historical conditions of those years. What phase were Western capitalist democracy reaching towards the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s? What major geopolitical events were paramount to this phase? And did the ecofeminist call for a mutation of the world really represent an ideological stance against these geopolitical events and against capitalism as such? Or on the contrary, it unfortunately failed to confront it? After the World War II ended with the defeating of the Nazis by the Soviet army, stopping Germany from transforming Eastern Europe into its East Indies, The Western states enrolled in a quest for consolidated capitalism as a hegemonic political, social, and economic system. Government expenditures were invested in the sphere of education, health, housing, and other social services meant to create the effect that the capitalist model can be as beneficial for the working class as the socialist model was in the Eastern European countries. However, as history wasn't slow in proving the opposite, the Western capitalist system, in its quest to maximize production and defeat its socialist counterpart, soon entered the whims of an inflationary spiral that heavily impacted the working class and jeopardized the minimal welfare infrastructure that it skimpily managed to build meantime with money and resources extracted from colonized lands. But while the majority of the population was left to endure the side effects of stagflation, the big capitalist military industry never ceased to prosper, even though, in order to do so, it needed to build up new crises to scale up its profits. During the 60s, the Cold War rivalry entered a new phase. Most of government expenditures started to be diverted towards developing further the already thriving military industry. The Cuban Missile Crisis from 1962 proved to be yet another pretext for the US to assert its military supremacy and for the Western European allies to coordinate in showing support and restate their commitment in winning the nuclear battle against what their propaganda channels succeeded in portraying as the absolute villain and the greatest threat to world stability, the USSR. In a report dating back to that period, to be found on the website of the Economic Bureau of US Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, one could read, global expenditures, and I quote, global expenditures from military purpose have reached a new record high level. From $132 billion in 1964, they rose to $138 billion in 1965, to $159 million in 1966, and an estimated $182 billion in 1967. Preliminary data suggest a continued rise in 1968. Military spending today exceeds that of any prior period except the peak fighting years of the World War II. Global military expenditures now take more than 7% of the world's gross product. In money terms, they are equivalent to the total annual income produced by 1 billion people living in Latin America, South Asia, and Near East. They are greater by 40% than worldwide expenditures on education by all levels of government and more than 3 times worldwide expenditures on public health. Sounds familiar, no? We are just living this again with the whole 5% of GDP going into the military, with the destruction of and privatizing of the last remnants of social infrastructure and ecological commons. France didn't fall behind in contributing to the numbers cited in the US report. Its commitment to nuclear militarization never staggered. In 1960, France detonated the first overground atomic bomb at Regan, the Algerian Sahara. Codenamed Gerboise Bleu, Bleu Gerboa, after a tiny jumping desert rodent, the bomb had a blast capacity about 4 times the strength of Little Boy, the United States atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima a month before the end of the World War II. But this was only the start in the French colonial regime showcase of nuclear power testing. From February 1960 to February 1966, the French colonial regime detonated 70 nuclear bombs in the Algerian Sahara, spreading radioactive fallout across Algeria, Central and West Africa, and the Mediterranean, including Southern Europe, and causing irreversible damage of both human and non-human life. With these toxic imprints, France became the fourth country to possess weapons for mass destruction after the United States of America, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the United Kingdom. These atomic tests were conducted despite Algeria's independence from France in 1962, after 132 years of French colonial rule. Starting in 1966, France moved its nuclear weapons testing from Algeria to another territory under French rule, Mururoa and Fangataufa atolls in colonized Tahiti Nui, or French colonized Polynesia as the French colonial regime called it, in the southern Pacific Ocean. Despite objection and demonstration, France conducted nearly 200 atmospheric and underground nuclear experiments in Mururoa and Fangataufa atolls from 1966 to 1996, destroying further colonized environments. This practice of conducting nuclear tests in occupied territories was not restrictive to France, but it was a common sense practice amongst imperialist states, with US playing the role model amongst themselves, having conducted 1,030 nuclear tests till 1992. So I'm offering this overview of this period because I think it's important to see how the connection between the material condition, the base actually, and the superstructure. That is the sphere of the discourse where essentialist ecofeminists thrive and appeared. There are many the concerns Françoise de Beaune touches in her book, ranging from worldwide consumption to urban population and global population growth, which she discusses in very Malthusian terms and sometimes in eugenistic terms. Yet the most important of them, that is the development of the modern imperial nuclear military complex, is slightly approached, if not totally obliterated. In a period when highly technological armament production was becoming one of the most important ways through which capitalism could preserve and extend its hegemony, de Beaune seems to be more preoccupied to condemn the feminist backwardness of the so-called third world countries than to condemn the plunder of both bodies and lands that capitalist military projects enabled in these territories. She rather proceeds in denouncing third world gender violence as emanating from imperfect Marxist-Leninist governments installed in the aftermath of a series of anti-colonial revolutions that took place in former colonies during the second half of the 20th century, than in exposing gender violence for what it was: the result of years of Western enslavement, slaughtering, mass displacements, exploitation, and dispossession. Her overview of Algeria, Ethiopia, Brazil, Cuba, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Chile, and I could go on because she treats the situation of these countries in few pages by citing mainly Western writers, is just another example of a racist Eurocentric gaze hidden under the pierced veil of an anthropological approach. This bourgeois white gaze prevents de Beaune from understanding the extent to which gender violence was and continues to be the product of a colonial capitalist system which whole design benefited from strong militaristic engagement. And at the same time, it prevents her from acknowledging that the first ecofeminist movements took root in the colonized lands as direct action to projects of colonization. In the last chapter of the accumulation of capital, entitled Militarism as a Province of Accumulation, Rosa Luxemburg explains in a forever present-day analysis how armament production enacts a war economy that affects the material conditions of the working class while scaling up financial gains for the capitalist ruling class. Her insight into the symbiotic relationship of capitalism, imperialism, and militarism breaks open the history of the Western civilization as the history of the capital rule imposition. And I will read this, this quote, this small quote from her, that I feel that is very much talking also to the present situation that we are living. Militarism fulfills a quite definite function in the history of capital, accompanying as it does every historical phase of accumulation. It plays a decisive part in the first stages of European capitalism in the period of the so-called primitive accumulation, as a means of conquering New World and spice-producing countries of India. Later, it is employed to subject the modern colonies, to destroy the social organization of primitive societies so that their means of production may be appropriated forcibly to introduce commodity trade in countries where the social structure had been unfavorable to it, and to turn the natives into a proletariat by compelling them to work for wages in the colonies. It is responsible for the creation and expansion of spheres of interest for European capital in non-European regions, for extorting railway concessions in backward countries, and for enforcing the claims of European capital as international lender. Finally, militarism is a weapon in the competitive struggle between capitalist countries for areas of non-capitalist civilization. In addition, capitalism has yet another important function. From the purely economic point of view, it is a preeminent means for the realization of surplus value. It is in itself a province of accumulation. And I have just a short observation, because I see that Rosa Luxemburg is starting to be very much used in all sorts of exhibitions and shows. And I think it's a pity that, yeah, while her name is being used, her entire political engaged work is either ignored or washed into portraying her less of an anti-capitalist theoretician and communist leader. And I think this practice is part of a liberal endeavor, which by means of depoliticizing key figures and historical events stays strong in its reverence to capital cultural hegemony, and whenever is due time, it quickly jumps into its defense. But to move further, as we've seen, militarism is frequently overshadowed as key component in the development of capitalism. In times of deep economic crisis, capitalism showcases its ammunition. In times of scarce stability, it sharpens its blades. The fact that Debon and other past and present ecofeminists who follow into her footsteps, and there are many, failed to address the military capitalist complex as key component in shaping the violence inflicted on both women and nature is very much the indicator of consenting to hegemonic understanding of the world. What's more, statement to this hegemonic understanding of the world is not only the bourgeois Western gaze deployed as a racist attempt to show solidarity with the colonized women, but also the essentialist perspective upon gender and nature and upon the relationship between women and nature. This essentialist perspective translates into an act of equating women with fecundity and nature with fertility, by adding substance to the historical capitalist naturalization of gender and feminization of nature. Identifying patriarchy at the root of both women's oppression and nature exploitation is not an emancipatory act, as it is often perceived by most feminists, and it can at times easily become an obstacle in our work of getting to the origin of both these subjugations. the shortcoming of a patriarchal-centered feminism, as the one elaborated by De Bono some 50 years ago, and nevertheless as the one largely embraced by contemporary mainstream feminists, comes from a trans-historical understanding of the male dominant system. In fact, this trans-historical understanding of patriarchy is consequence to the lack of historical materialist analysis, and even more yet, to a dialectical one. As any other social system, patriarchy emerged historically in close relation to the economic production system. In this regard, patriarchy is part of the arsenal of systems that make up the capitalist institutionalized social order. But so is essentialist ecofeminism. Asserting a definition of gender in essentialist terms means no attack on patriarchy, nor on capitalism. On the contrary, manufacturing a universal definition not only of gender, but also of nature, is no less than manufacturing consent for a permanent, constant annexation of both. To view the solution in a society placed in the feminine, or in a planet placed in the feminine, as the French militant feminist does, as some of our present ecofeminists do, is no way forward to accomplishing any societal or ecological revolution. On the contrary, this would not be a revolution, but a mutation, as De Bono initially proposed, a mutation within the capitalist system so that it can emerge as having a more human face. It is then hardly surprising that this type of ecofeminism grew up to become popular in the cultural sphere and to be nowadays the prevalent lens to which we look at the relationship between nature and women, and more precisely at the relationship between the natural body, the nature bodies, and feminized bodies. The essentialist ecofeminist view sticks obediently to the ways in which historically the capitalist system brought together women and nature. While decisively overturning previous arrangements, the capitalist system separated between the realm of production and the realm of reproduction, but by operating a sexualized division of gender, which translated further into a sexualized division of labor on one hand. On the other, the capitalist system enacted a separation between the natural realm and the society realm, that is between human and non-human, or what the eco-essentialist theoreticians, borrowing from Marx, frame today as the metabolic rift. These separations serve as necessary conditions for the capitalist system to preserve its self-expanding value, namely its objective unending capital accumulation. The sexualized division of gender entitled and perpetuated an essentialist definition of gender and the biological determination of women, which solidified in generational replenishment and life maintenance. That is birth-giving, child and elderly care, cooking, sexual labor, what Marxist feminists call today starting from the 70s, social reproduction labor, while liberal feminists understand as life-making. While some of these labors were partially socialized by the capitalist system in devising a social infrastructure that is accessible only to certain classes and certain non-racialized populations, I am referring here to kindergartens, school, hospitals, university, a lot of these feminized labors continue to be treated as non-economic, although they are deeply economic in enabling further capital accumulation. Feminized labor is made into a resource for capital, one whose value is always retracted, presupposed, or disavowed. However, the question is not to ask for their enclosure into the circuit of capital accumulation by simply being recognized as labor, but to bring out into the open their political potentiality in building up counter-hegemonic mass movements. The same non-economic logic is being exerted by capitalism to define nature as a resource capable of infinite regeneration and self-restoration. Nowadays, we see this definition failing in several epistemic points and in several geographies, even in the imperial core. Yet, essentialist ecofeminist supporters seem to be persistent in keeping their eyes shut and their allegiance to the imperial core. By exerting a gendered understanding of nature as Mother Nature, they not only abide the complete dismantling of the last ecological commons, but they legitimate and fuel this process. My point is that we cannot adequately grasp capitalist ecological contradiction without thinking it together with its social reproductive contradiction. Although the system works to separate both nature and reproduction labor from the economy, it always sets in motion extensive interaction among them, between nature and feminized labor on one side, and between nature, feminized labor, and the economy on the other. And all these interactions are expressions of the material historical conditions and take different forms in accordance with different regimes of accumulation. They had different forms in the period of the mercantile capitalism, and they had different forms in the neoliberal capitalism system, and now they are changing into a different form. So, to conclude, neither history nor ideologies follow a linear temporality. And as a consequence, the Western thick air of the 70s seems to have speared into the present days, thickening once more, this time with neo-fascism. The neoliberal capitalist system that began to destroy everything in its path during the mid-70s, starting with Chile, and expanding into the Eastern Europe territories once the socialist regimes were overthrown, is currently mutating into a new phase, an authoritarian one. Capitalism is bringing out into the open its dictatorial phase. Throughout genocides, we see the genocide in Palestine, the attack on Iran, through wars, through austerity politics, to large amounts of expenditures going into the military complex industrial system, is building up an assault on what remains of the ecological commons and of the public social infrastructure. And unfortunately, feminism, and more exactly essentialist ecofeminism, is manufacturing consensus for this to happen. And I will leave you with this image of Eva, this work of Eva Cerbu, which is an artist that made this work in 1978, and it talks about how we can actually understand the labor of women from a socialist point of view, along with Alexandra Kollontai, which talked about the women labor in the evolution of the economical system. And yeah.
Czy ktoś z Państwa ma jakieś pytania? Dobrze.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm just wondering if you can give examples, like specific examples of people or artists who have like an essential feminist.
Well,
I know you don't. I know you don't want to, because it's difficult to criticize like specific, artworks.
Yes.
Or yeah.
Well, I will talk about events. For example, Malta Biennale. The first Malta Biennale last year was very much looking into the question of maternity, but from trying to do that from a decolonial point of view. like going into how we can recuperate the matriarchal period, like and but from a decolonial point of view, and bringing that into the Western space is very much kind of reinforcing this essentialist view upon women and upon the labor of women and upon nature. So I think there are we can see this also in different exhibitions that are talking about Mother Nature, about the womb of nature, and it's very much I think it's very spread right now, this conception, especially in terms of proposing an ecological length by using a very gendered, as I said, a very gendered look upon nature, and yeah, it's I think it's very common. I wouldn't like to bring up names. I would like to bring up frames. I think this is more important than names, because in constructing a very a critical frame is not about the individualistic, like the individuals. It's more about the frames and the spaces and the cultural spaces as being places where this essentialist, ecofeminist view is perpetuated and is very much preserved.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I think you might be on track on something very interesting with your critique on decoloniality, because the binaries that are sort of inscribed in the theory, right? This division between Western and non-Western, between indigenous and Western again. I'm wondering if that does not reinscribe nature within the paradigm of the indigenous.
Well,
and I think that's a very necessary critique, and a critique that's kind of starting to emerge and somehow, touches upon what you said.
Well, there are, of course, several decolonial insights and views. What I feel, and I think is very connected to what you said, is that the decoloniality nowadays is becoming very much a Western. It's very Westernized. It's a Western discourse. So it's very much disengaged with the anti-colonial struggles and with its anti-colonial roots. And in the capitalist present that we nowadays live, I think it's more important to talk about this anti-colonial perspective and anti-colonial framework of pushing up political actions and political works. And in terms of nature and indigenous and indigeneity and how it's very tricky, because if you bring this into the very white Western core or not so white, let's say, Eastern European region, it's kind of unrooting. You unroot this discourse, and it's basically a displacement. You displace this from its original place, and you put it into a very white and very I think it's a very appropriating. And very depoliticized and very separated from its historical root.
But also probably it sort of simplifies the historical relation that has been between indigenous communities and nature, that does not follow just the model of like Mother Earth, but probably involved also more conflictual and expropriative relations.
Of course. And I think this, like all this concept of modern, of Mother Earth, is very much a Western construct than an indigenous one. And yeah, but it's debatable. We can, yeah. It's.
Czy ktoś jeszcze ma pytania?
I just wanted to say that I thought about Silvia Federici, which was finally released in Poland right now. The Caliban and the Witch was finally translated to Polish, so it's like I thought of that, and when I'm thinking of this painting, I also think of Silvia Federici, which is like this primitive accumulation that you were saying is like. She's pointing it, and I think in Poland it's not so so popular to say that. I think it's quite radical.
Yeah, Silvia Federici or
and no, I'm not even talking about her, but just like this accumulation of like woman work.
It's radical, like to talk about that.
Yes, because it's not in discourse. We don't have it that much, but I think it's like maybe everywhere. I don't know, but in Poland, I can say that it's not that popular. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question because you like based your critique on also like a Western thoughts and Western events, like to relate to that. And I wanted to ask you, can you notice something specific how this notion of the ecofeminism was like absorbed by the Eastern countries after, let's say, 1989, and that popped up also all of this, I don't know how it worked in Romania, but this references to also to this like a slogans you've mentioned appeared during like a, let's say, first wave of feminism after the fall of the socialist state here. So I wanted to ask you, do you notice like something characteristic in the process of absorbing this still Western notion and thoughts of the essentialist ecofeminism? I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah, it's a good question. So of course, there are similarities in how we kind of talk about feminism in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and in similarities with the imperial core, with the Western countries. And I think this similarity is very much a question how this feminist movement are positioning themselves in relation to power, in relation to capital, in relation to accumulation. What I feel like is that liberal feminism, as I said, and neoconservative feminists are very much in the front lines of how the feminist discourse is constructed. And of course, the socialist Marxist discourse is not at all present. And I think the main problem is the anti-communist discourse and the anti-communist propaganda that is very much thriving nowadays. and especially in former socialist countries.
Especially in Romania.
Especially in Romania, but I don't think this is only, is only to be pointed, like to be found in Romania. But I think that while condemning and rejecting the socialist regime as the cultural elites do and as the cultural sphere does, is very much an obstacle into constructing a more radical socialist discourse. So it's also an obstacle into having more knowledge about what's happening in the with the capitalist system. So I think this is the main problem, that the anti-communist elites are making gatekeeping capital and capital hegemony. And while doing that, they kind of reinforce enslavement and chaining once more women, nature, feminized bodies, and so on. So it's, I think this is one of the main problems is the anti-communist discourse that is very much permeated and is very much sustained by the capitalist system itself.
European neoliberalism. Czy ktoś jeszcze z Państwa?
Do you have any questions? All right, we'll stay here for a bit. You can drink some water, and our keynote speaker will be present here. Thank you very much. Our recording will also be available quite soon. Thank you very much for your presence, and have a good evening. Thank you, Anca, for coming.